Hi, welcome to our presentation today about specific learning disabilities. I'm Carl Leopson, an associate professor at the University of Arizona, and this presentation was originally created by some of my students at the University of Arizona, and the presentation was so good that I decided to share it with you for this course. Take a look at these celebrities. Which one do you think has a specific learning disability? You probably know who these people are. You ready to find out? If you chose Tom Cruise, you're correct. But how about this set of celebrities? Which one do you think has a specific learning disability? You know, all of them have suggested that they have a specific learning disability. So can you really just look at people and tell who has a learning disability? No, you can't. So how can you tell? Well, we're going to talk about that a little today. And these are the objectives for this session. By the time we're done, you should be able to list at least 3 of the 8 categories associated with an identification of specific learning disorders. You should be able to describe one or more of the following: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. You should be able to describe the discrepancy model for identifying specific learning disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit about accommodations for students with specific learning disabilities, but we'll do more of that in another session. So what is a specific learning disability? It's a disorder in one or more of the psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written. Now, these problems manifest themselves in a number of areas. Could be listening, thinking, speaking, reading, writing, spelling, and doing math. More specifically, there are 8 categories under which a child might be identified or qualify for assistance in the category of specific learning disability. And actually, that's why they're called specific learning disabilities, because a child has to be identified under one of the 8 categories, one or more. In the area of communication, there's oral problems, listening problems, and written problems. In the area of reading, there's basic skills problems, like phonetic problems, fluency problems, and that involves reading at a rate that is appropriate, and comprehension problems. And you can see that these could build together. A person with problems in basic phonetic skills will probably have some fluency problems and some comprehension problems. Finally, there are specific learning disabilities in the area of math, although they're much more rare than in communication or in reading. The terms you'll hear most oftenly associated with specific learning disabilities are dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia, but they're not necessarily listed in federal law. So we're really looking for problems in processing, memory and retention, and visual and spatial reasoning. We should look at what specific learning disabilities are not. They are not problems associated with being an English language learner, although there are tests for students who are English language learners who can also have specific learning disabilities. It is not cognitive impairment. cognitive impairment, students with significant cognitive impairment often fall under the category, not as it is listed here, mental retardation, but the category that's been retermed intellectual disabilities. Environmental, cultural, and economic issues can be factors in a specific learning disability, and they can be associated with specific learning disabilities. Now, people with vision, hearing, or motor impairments can also have specific learning disabilities, but we don't identify specific learning disabilities by necessarily looking at visual, hearing, or motor impairments directly. Let's talk about each of those categories: dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. Dyslexia is a neurobiological disorder. It affects about 15% of Americans. It's a processing disorder. It's often associated with people who have problems breaking words down into their significant parts or phonemes. You might notice difficulty identifying information from details, difficulty in sounding out words, confusion between letters and sounds, and difficulty summarizing. Though there can be difficulties in sounding out words or phonologic problems, but there can also be orthographic problems or problems in the form of the word. This is a little activity that might help you understand what it's like for a student to have difficulty in recognizing and using phonemes to identify words, and then make sense of them as sentences, and then comprehend those sentences. See if you can decode this passage so that it makes some sense. The key is down below. You might want to stop the video for a moment to give yourself a chance to get it right. Makes a lot more sense like this, doesn't it? And that's because you have the ability to look at words, recognize phonemes, fit them into some scheme that makes sense as a sentence, understand that with fluency or at a speed that allows you to understand or comprehend the basic ideas of the sentence and the whole paragraph. We'll talk more detail about accommodations or strategies another time or in another course. There are lots of things that we do in special education and in education in general to assist people who have problems with reading. Word games, rhyming games are good. Daily reading, out loud or not out loud. Reading organizers are ways to help students organize their reading so that it makes more sense and is more efficient. Multisensory learning techniques, and all that really means is coming up with techniques that use multiple senses to make sense out of the words. And intensive phonics training, which is one of the more common things that we do. Dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is more associated with writing. Right? There is a dyslexic dysgraphia, which involves poor spelling. This issue of the finger tapping test It's a test designed to determine whether a person problems in writing are associated with motor skills or damage to some portion of the brain that helps control motor skills. There is the possibility of motor problems, in which you might see slanted writing, poor spelling, poor copying ability, and spatial problems. What might you see in a student with dysgraphia? Oh, cramping of fingers in short writing exercises, maybe because they've avoided a lot of writing. Excessive erasures, or they recognize that they make a lot of errors. Mixed uppercase and lowercase letters, misuse of lines and margins, or general writing conventions on paper. Poor legibility, meaning that it's difficult to understand what they've written. And inconsistent form and size of letters. You might notice other signs or symptoms, but just think about the characteristics we've talked about and how they might play out in a student's writing.
I want you to write things that are true and accurate about the metric system that you know.
I remember what I want to write, but when I write it down, I'll forget words and stuff.
So if you focus on the mechanical parts of writing, it's hard to have good ideas.
Yeah, so it's sort of hard for me to focus on both of them.
One of the most common writing liabilities in middle school occurs in a student for whom nothing is automatic when it comes to writing. It may be that forming letters is taking too much time and effort, or the recall of spelling or punctuation is requiring a tremendous search of memory in order to do it properly. And kids who have what we call delayed automatization, they just can't remember the little bits and pieces of writing automatically, often hate to write.
In addition to the memory requirements of writing, students also need to be able to organize and arrange their thoughts in a logical order.
So what's that paragraph saying?
Nick has learning problems with processing. He can't do more than one thing at a time. When he's writing, he can't write and be creative and spell and use all the grammar and all the punctuation. So that has to be more steps for him. Well, if we covered it by 3 rhombuses, what would we have covered?
Well, like when the teacher's going fast, she wants us to write notes, I might have to might look over and see what other notes people have.
Why is that?
Because I can't keep up with the notes.
Let's look at some examples. Can you make sense of this? That's what legibility means. Means that you've got to be able to read it and make sense of it. And you may be able to. You can probably tell eventually that this student is writing about money and friends, actually fairly eloquently, but his writing doesn't make that clear to us. You can see that there are problems with general conventions in writing. You can see this student probably has a pretty good sense of phonetics, right? So that the mistakes that they make in terms of words, if you look at them and you know phonics, you could sound them. Like in the 4th line from the bottom at the end, people, P-E-P-L-E. Or on the next line, always. Now how about this sample? It looks like this student was responding to questions about a story they'd read. And the man and boy live in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Difficult to understand, but you can see again that there are problems with conventions in writing, formations of letters, spelling, But when there are spelling problems, they're more associated with the form of the word, or what the word should look like versus what it should sound like. If you try to sound most of these, they're pretty accurate. Here's one final example from a younger student. Talking about their favorite foods. Again, this student probably has a pretty good understanding of phonics. In the first line, you can see the word spaghetti and really, but they have problems remembering the form of the letter or form of the word. Oh, here's one more. You may want to turn off the video. Take a look at this by yourself and see if you can find some of the common problems for a student with dysgraphia. Again, we'll talk about strategies another time, but there are lots of ways now that we can accommodate writing. We can modify tasks to minify the usage of the area of weakness. We can work on handwriting skills, which is something that would make sense to do. And we can help them understand their issues so that they can deal with it more openly and directly. Some technological options might include the spell checker for these students, or a speech-to-text. Dyscalculia is a math-specific learning disability. So it's a difficulty dealing with numbers, manipulating them, and that becomes really difficult, especially as children get into grades where they have to manipulate numbers, have to manipulate them in their head, have to have a sense of numbers, something we'll talk about another time called number sense. What are some symptoms, some general symptoms? Well, problems reading analog clocks and a difficult time actually conceptualizing time. Problems with general financial planning or budgeting, although lots of us have those problems. Difficulty reading musical notation, and that's just, a lot of us don't read music, but that would mean that regardless of the instruction that we might provide in reading musical notation, a student might have difficulty. Difficulty differentiating right from left, and even poor orientation when reading a map. Just remember that these are general symptoms you might see. There are many others. Just think again about how the characteristics we've talked about might play out in the everyday work of a student. We don't know a lot about remediating dyscalculia. We do a fairly good job, or we can do a fairly good job of providing some accommodations through some software. Don't know much about neurosensory education therapy, and the inclusion of that in here is something I can't really talk about. Here's a little activity that might help you understand the difficulty that student could encounter in sequencing numbers and making sense of numbers. Keep in mind too that a student going through an activity in math like long division, who hasn't had good experiences with numbers, has difficulty keeping them in his or her short-term memory and working with them in their head is going to have trouble with things like long division. Here's the activity. Again, you might want to turn off the video for a minute or two to see what difficulties you run into when you try to solve this problem. Here are the answers, just in case you're interested. But the real goal of this activity was to understand a little about the frustration that students with dyscalculia are going to have in math and in a number of math-related activities in school. Let's talk really quickly about some diagnostic methods. This says, unlike other disabilities and IEP categories, specific learning disabilities describe the symptoms of their problems, not the cause. You know, the categories are split in that regard. Categories like traumatic brain injury talk about the cause, but a lot actually of categories that we use in special education describe the symptoms or the issues and not the actual cause. Response to intervention is one of the newer methods for diagnosing specific learning disabilities. It was written into federal law as one option that states and districts can use to identify students with specific learning disabilities. It's a larger topic. We'll talk about it at another time in the course. The discrepancy model is the traditional method for identifying learning disabilities. And really, it's all about cognitive ability versus achievement and looking for a gap between what a person should be able to do based on their cognitive ability versus how they actually perform in a number of categories. And IQ is generally considered the measure of cognitive ability. Achievement is measured with any number of achievement tests like the Woodcock-Johnson, which is the most common. School psychologists are the ones that are most likely to give the IQ tests. They may also do the achievement testing, but special education teachers are also trained to do achievement testing. You can see in the column on the left the scores for various areas in the IQ test, and in the column on the right various areas for achievement testing, and that are associated broadly with those 8 categories that we talked about for identification in specific learning disabilities. Let's look at some examples. What do you think this student might qualify for in terms of specific learning disabilities, given an IQ of around 100 and the scores in the sub-areas of achievement listed below? Probably math calculation and math reasoning, right? Those other categories are either equal to or above what we would expect in terms of their ability and IQ score. Does this student appear to qualify for any category in specific learning disabilities? Doesn't look like it. They have scores that all are just about commensurate with or above their expected achievement level. Again, we'll talk about accommodations more specifically in another class. But we have to remember that the problems that a student with a specific learning disability is going to manifest can be really different based on the problems that are identified. And so we really should provide a truly individualized curriculum and a truly individualized set of accommodations. These factors could come together differently for every student. And these students are going to have different histories in school. And they're going to be different ages. And they're going to be different demands placed on their academics depending on what grade level they're in and what the curriculum is. Lots of students learn compensatory skills that allow them to succeed if they have specific learning disabilities. Students with specific learning disabilities are performing better and better in general education settings. I see lots of students in my college courses who talk to me individually about growing up with specific learning disabilities. They've clearly learned how to succeed, and that's something else we should talk about another time. We won't have time to perform this activity today. We'll do this activity another time. So let's go back over what might be questions on a quiz. You should be able to look back through this presentation and identify 3 of the 8 categories in which a child with a specific disability, a specific learning disability, might be identified. You should be able to choose from dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia and describe one problem, one symptom, and one simple accommodation. And finally, I don't expect you to be able to fully describe the discrepancy model for identifying students with a specific learning disability, but to be able to understand that the discrepancy model is about identifying a difference between a student's ability level, as generally measured on an IQ test, with their achievement level, that's generally measured on a variety of achievement tests. That's the end of this presentation. When you're finished here, you should be able to go back to the website, take a look at the quiz questions, and if you need to, you can run back through this presentation to help you answer the questions that will be on the quiz. See you later for another presentation.